Okay, good morning, everyone, depending on where you are. It's about start time, so we'll go ahead and begin. I do have a brief introduction to share for our two speakers this morning regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion practices. So our first speaker will be Andrea Jameson, a PhD. She'll share creating strategic and embedded diversity practices, and her conversation will discuss reconceptualizing diversity in order to move beyond ad hoc programs that are not intrinsically embedded as part of institutional core values and daily practices. The goal of her session will be to recognize the existence of diversity and reflect it in such a way that its presence is normalized in daily routines. And she'll highlight ways to sustain inclusion efforts in the following critical areas: inclusive language, inclusive learning environments, and inclusive text selection. Then we'll also hear from Mark A. Puente, who will share his experiences in building and implementing DEI strategies at Purdue University. The Purdue University Libraries and School of Information Studies has recently committed to building a strategy to address issues of equity, inclusion, belonging, and accessibility. This includes assessing the operational and developmental needs of the unit, as well as exploring ways to support broader campus programs and initiatives. Puente will discuss the steps Pulsis has initiated, including establishing its inaugural Council on Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging. With that being said, we'll hear from our two speakers, and we'll also have some time at the end to address any questions that arise. So please feel free to use the chat feature as you see fit while they're presenting, and we'll go ahead and moderate that at the end. My name is Annette Bohenik. I'll be joined with Lee Milligan, who is also on this committee with me and will help me co-moderate. So with that being said, thank you so much. I guess, Andrea, then if you want to share your screen, you should be able to do so.
All right, just give me just a moment.
Perfect.
All right, so thank you for inviting me. And so I'm really excited to be here and to talk to you about something that I am very passionate about, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion, EDI or DEI, as it's been stated in so many different ways. I want to begin with just talking a little bit about myself, who am I, and how I got here. So let's see, give me 1 second just to, all right. Okay. So my computer is just a little slow. Okay. So I do want to share my contact information. I don't know if my data is slowing down. So I'm going to try to make sure. Just let me know if you can't hear me or if I freeze for a moment. But I am an assistant professor at Illinois State University. I work in the College of Education. I do work with pre-service teachers as well as pre-service librarians. I spent, prior to going to Illinois State University, I also worked at Valparaiso University. I spent 2 years at Valparaiso as a diversity fellow. Prior to that, I worked in schools as a self-contained classroom teacher. And then I also spent half that time, about 17 years, half of that time spent as a school librarian. And so because I am pre-tenured, I'm always interested in collaborations and research opportunities. My research is heavily vetted or vested in looking at how people of color are marginalized in children's literature and analyzing policies and other systems or structures that really either perpetuate or mitigate diversity and equities with regards to children and education or other inequities that are present in the literature. So I want to sort of start this conversation with just talking a little bit about diversity, some of the issues and problems with diversity itself. And so conversations about diversity has been happening for about a little bit more than maybe half a century now. And if we talk about diversity, it's a really big buzzword. But the problem with diversity is that diversity is such a big term. right? When we talk about diversity, it applies to so many different situations, it applies to so many different groups that it really doesn't bring to the forefront those groups that have been historically marginalized or that have been oppressed by specific systems that have created disadvantages for those groups or those communities. And so when we look at the definition of diversity, you're thinking about all types of groups. We're talking about diversity in terms of being socially or economically disadvantaged. We're talking about diversity in terms of being diverse in terms of race or culture or ethnicity or experience. And even now, especially in libraries, diversity also points to being advantaged or privileged in terms of information and also being disadvantaged in terms of information as well. And so, because diversity is so big, and so because diversity is so nuanced, sometimes it's a big term that really accomplishes very little if we're not specific or if we are not intentional about our diversity efforts or our diversity practices. So, um, when we're thinking about diversity, we have to think about all of the arguments that come with diversity. We talk about it so much that you have arguments in terms of what we view as color blindness, where you have groups of people that feel as if I don't see race. Race is not important to me. And when you start thinking about some of these arguments, it just furthers the problems that we face in terms of diversity. Again, if we're thinking about being diverse in terms of everyone, then we no longer bring to the forefront those groups or those communities that have been historically marginalized. So, this conversation really talks about how do we change that dynamic? How do we change that dynamic? And how do we make sure that those groups that need to be included are included? How do we make sure that equity is provided for those groups that have been oppressed by different systems or by infrastructures that have disadvantaged them economically, socially, or just in terms of opportunity and how wealth and resources are distributed? And so, also with diversity, we find that there's also a lack of community effort. We talk about diversity so much, but usually the onus or the responsibility for diversity is often placed on diverse groups. So we bring diverse groups into our communities or our institutions, and those groups feel overwhelmed. And I spend a lot of time on different groups, serving on different committees, and a lot of the conversations we have are centered around this idea of uh, we feel as if every conversation, every initiative about diversity, that we're the ones that's supposed to lead that charge. So we feel as if we're part of the community to help that institution or that community uh, reach their diversity efforts or their diversity goals, but it doesn't feel as if it's a community effort. We don't feel as if we're part of a team that's working towards making sure that everyone's represented, that there is inclusivity for everyone, but we feel as if we're just that person there that is that representation or that voice for diversity. So that is a question that often comes up, and we have to think about how do we change that, right? And then another problem that involves diversity is this idea of constantly talking about diversity. We get stuck in this cycle of strategic planning. And I like to think of a quote by Walt Disney that says, that if we're constantly talking about a problem or situation, then we are doing little to address it. So if we're talking about diversity all the time, and if all of our effort is in the planning phase, when do we ever get to the point in our conversations and in our practices that we're actually moving towards sustainability, implementation, and sustainability? And so I do have some things that I do want to just talk about in terms of different ways to think about diversity. And a lot of it is born out of my research in terms of just these three ideas: being specific, specificity, making sure diversity is embedded through everything, and then being transparent. So, I also want to talk about this quote. Angela Davis once stated that diversity is about justice. So, when we think about diversity, are we thinking about in terms of trying to make sure that we just have these diversity statements that are benign, or that we have these policies, or that we have these mission statements that really do nothing in terms of impacting the day-to-day lives of groups that have been marginalized, or really do nothing in terms of changing culture or shifting the mindset of people within our community. And so, one of the ways that we can begin to sort of unravel that is to start thinking about diversity in terms of diversity being a vehicle for justice. How do we ensure that everyone's not only included, but how do we ensure that opportunities, that everyone is given the same type of latitude, and those groups that have been disadvantaged, they're being supported in such a way that they are on equal footing with everyone else, and that we're really truly building a community of justice for everyone. And so, again, thinking about this quote that Angela Davis stated, one of the things that she mentioned in this quote that I find to be very poignant is this idea is that diversity and inclusion without significant change and without being radical, without undoing those systems and processes that have been in place for hundreds of years, or for even longer, for many centuries, if we don't begin to unravel or dismantle some of those normal way of doing, just that normal way of doing business, business as usual, when we are cognizant that that same system or that same way of conducting business may have created oppressive conditions for certain groups, if we don't begin to unravel or dismantle some of those processes and procedures, then what are we really accomplishing in terms of diversity? Right. And again, the idea that diversity is so big that if we try to tackle it as a whole without really honing in on those specific communities and groups that have been historically marginalized or oppressed, if we don't bring those groups to the forefront, then we're not making the most of our efforts. So we want to think about being strategic in terms of our diversity efforts. And so, here's some other considerations. How do we change those systems? How do we change the normal way of doing business? What systems? We have to start pinpointing those systems that need to change. Maybe they're the way that we hire our faculty. It's the way that we bring in our staff. How do we recruit? Right? I've often been in a lot of institutions, and I've talked to different groups and different institutions, and the conversation is usually around we need to retain, we need to hire more faculty of color. But usually that's where the conversation stops, because you can't have a conversation about hiring faculty of color without also having conversations about retaining faculty of color. Right? When you are hiring faculty of color, are faculty of color part of that hiring process? Right? And if faculty of color, if what is your turnover rate? Do you have faculty of color that come and go? What positions are those faculty members being hired into? Right? And are those faculty visible within the community? uh, when you're talking about training faculty, and I find that a lot of times we are vested a lot in participating in these these on and off diversity training sessions where we listen to the information, but we're not giving opportunity to practice and to really utilize the information that has been given to us, and to really put it in practice, right? And so, thinking about diversity as justice, we're thinking about a mind shift. We're thinking about changing the culture. And so, how do we change that culture? Do we need to require more than just having faculty sit in on meetings that's talking about diversity? Do we need to attach some type of accountability to it? Should staff be held accountable? Should we be evaluated in terms of how we create inclusive environments specifically for our students? How we model diversity? If we say we believe in it, how do we model that in practice and just not in conversation? What about the student climate? We often think about diversity efforts in terms of making sure that our faculty receive training on cultural competence. But we don't think about the interactions, the day-to-day interactions that students, and maybe we think about it, but maybe we don't think about it enough, but what about the day-to-day interactions that students have with other students? So if our efforts are to recruit and retain students of color, we have to make sure that we have an environment that supports them, not just inside the classroom, because part of the student experience, especially on college campuses, part of that experience deals with having interaction with faculty. And while you may have faculty that's trained in being culturally conscious or being sensitive or being able to really foster that idea of mutual respect across cultural lines, if students are engaging with other students and those interactions are hostile, then that will really disadvantage us in terms of being able to retain students. Right. So how do we make sure that our students have the opportunity to learn, to become allies, right? And to learn about other cultures and learn about diversity and to develop empathy? Are we giving them these opportunities outside of the class? So within my classroom, my students know that it is a non-negotiable. We're going to talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion, especially in terms of creating classrooms that are equitable and that facilitate or demonstrate anti-oppressive pedagogy. But a lot of times when I'm having conversations about diversities with my students, um, I feel there's this balance, sense of balance or a power balance that impacts them, where I don't feel that students can openly share because obviously they want to say the right thing so that their grades are not negatively impacted. So how do we create a safe environment where students can learn to become allies and foster a sense of empathy that's not attached to their grades or attached to their assignments, right? Because again, we need buy-in, and that buy-in has to be intrinsic. And if we attach it to grades, then students will only participate. Well, you will have a lot of students that will only participate because it's something that they have to do and it's not really a value that they buy into. Okay. So here are my recommendations. And again, my recommendations are born out of my research. And while my research looked at policies, I do think that some of these recommendations can be applied broadly. But thinking again in terms of just specificity, we have to start naming communities. We have to focus our diversity efforts. When we talk about diversity, who are we talking about? Right? Let's start naming communities. Let's start bringing those communities that have been historically marginalized or historically oppressed to the forefront. We cannot be afraid to say we have to do more for our LGBT community. We have to do more for our African American community, or we have to do more to protect our Muslim students. We have to begin to strategically start to identify the groups that we are trying to create inclusion for. Ultimately, we want inclusion to be normative, to just be the norm of who we are and what we represent. But in order for us to get there, we have to start unraveling those systems that, again, have disadvantaged certain communities. And again, we have to start having these conversations in tandem with what's happening in society, right? Look at what's happening to our Asian communities. We have to begin to bring those conversations into our diversity conversations and talk about what can we do to make sure that Asians aren't continually attacked on our campus. How do we let our communities know that we do not condone this, right? How do we, again, facilitate conversations around empathy? We have to agree on a language. What is meant by diversity? What is meant by social justice if you're going to adapt this language? And we have to embed that language in everything. We have to embed that language in our syllabi. We have to use that language across different colleges, across the campus, in different departments. We have to agree not only on the language that we want to use, but we also have to agree on the language that we're not going to use. Some language is dated, and while I don't have a lot of time to get into it, I really find that, a lot of times there are a lot of institutions that say we are diverse, but then we still use language when we refer to groups or community of color. We still use language like minority, right? And if we think about that connotatively, it's not only dated, but connotatively, it's offensive. So, how do we change the language and how do we agree on terminology that's appropriate, that reflects our current understanding of diversity and the trajectory of where we're going with our inclusion efforts, and we're not mirroring times that were historic or oppressive or completely hostile to certain communities? We have to start thinking about ways to incorporate theoretical perspectives into our classroom. And this is where we get a lot of resistance, because we oftentimes we hear faculty members say, well, my discipline or my field of study doesn't lend itself to be able to just incorporate diversity. And I like to offer that diversity can be infused in everywhere, in every subject, in every curriculum, because when we think about diversity in terms of justice, how can you argue or advocate for justice in your respective fields, or how can you create an environment that's just welcoming and accommodating for everyone, and that shows respect or mutual respect for everyone? And so, again, some of the ways that you can do that, you can start thinking about theories. Bring in those theories like critical theory or critical race theory. Bring in some of those theories that push back on some of these systems, and use those theories to build conversations and topics about justice for everyone. Uh, can you bring in textbooks by authors of color, if not textbook, because again, we know that people of color have been marginalized in terms of representation and in terms of authenticity or authorship, and in textbooks, and not only just in the children's literature, but can you supplement readings by diverse authors? Can you bring in speakers that are from diverse groups who can add or enrich your students' perspectives on certain topics? So even if your field of study is math, is there a mathematician of color that has gained significant experience or expertise in their field? Can you bring them in as a guest author? And again, and so my last 2 points. We have to fund those diversity efforts. We can't have diversity with not putting our money where our mouth is, because usually when we have these diversity efforts, they're not intrinsically embedded in who we are. So when funding is cut, what's usually the first thing to go? Our diversity program. So how do we make diversity non-negotiable? Right. And the way we make it non-negotiable is that we have to put it in our policies. We have to make it a part of our core institutional values. And then we also have to be transparent. We have to share what is being done within our classrooms, across departments, so that we can interrogate our practices, so that we can learn from each other. We can find out what we're doing that's not working, so that we can minimize that work, and then focus more on what is working, so that we can further those efforts, and that we can grow those efforts towards what's working. And so with that being said, that's it. I know that that was kind of quick, but I was trying to keep it within the 15 minutes.
Thanks so much. And then we'll go ahead and switch over to Mark. So Mark, you should be able to share your screen as well.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good, okay. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears just a little bit and talk about what this experience has been like. I'm within an institutional context. I'm relatively new to Purdue. I started in Purdue in August 8th. Little piece of advice, yes. If you're interested in making a career change, it might be important for you to think about how to manage that during a global pandemic. So it has made everything very interesting. Luckily, I had a number of connections to Purdue University before I even applied for the position here. But I want to talk to you just a little bit about some of the work that we have been doing, and just, kudos to Andrea. That's just, you gave us an awful lot to think about, and something that I think we are committed to thinking about and planning for here at Purdue. But I want to recognize and just acknowledge that our plans are very, very nascent, as Annette previously or indicated in the introduction. We in many ways are just starting with this work as a unit, and our unit consists of libraries. It's called a school. We call it a School of Information Studies, but it's all inclusive, of course, of archives, our Office of Undergraduate Research, and also our publishing unit. But as I mentioned, there was no real portfolio, if you will, in this space prior to my arrival here, although we have a number of people that are working within our unit that are very, very engaged. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And thinking about beginning this work, initiating this work in the backdrop of some very dramatic things, obviously COVID-19 and all that we know about the desperate impacts of COVID-19, of the global pandemic, particularly on communities of color, but also on those who are living in poverty and that sort of thing. And of course, the year of unrest and protestations here in the US and really globally that have happened around the racial justice movement. And we're building this portfolio in, I've termed this a seemingly dichotomous institutional context. And I say that because like many institutions in the Midwest, we are in the middle of Indiana, and probably not what one might think about in terms of geography as the bastion of diversity in terms of at least like racial and ethnic diversity, right? We do have certainly diverse populations. I think the African American community, the Black community in the state of Indiana is at something about around 8% of our overall population. Our student population is far below that. I think it's closer to something around 3%, but 3%, just as an example. So in a seemingly homogeneous sort of environment and campus where we do have a very robust international student population that has, I think, unique needs, unique ways of engaging and interacting with the many systems that Andrea mentioned earlier, many of them very complex and very few of them, maybe, I don't know, maybe not any of them necessarily created to really accommodate difference, in spite of the land grant, nature of and status of our institution. And in spite of the fact also seemingly dichotomous in that there are many, many people, many units around campus that are highly, highly committed to this work. So how do we begin to build a profile as a unit that both leverages the existing opportunities and the existing strengths that we have on campus, and also the expertise that we have within our unit, within the Purdue University Library and School of Information Studies. As I mentioned, we have many campus exemplars who have been doing this work for much longer. In fact, our School of Veterinary Medicine has actually won awards for their diversity plan. But again, they've been at this for a little bit longer, completely different context, right? The libraries don't have a student population, but we serve all students and all researchers. So those dynamics make things for a little bit, make things nuanced for us, different for us in terms of our approaches and how we can engage in this work in meaningful and authentic ways. We in many ways have a very supportive administration here. Certainly administration of the libraries and School of Information Studies. We have a highly supportive dean who really tracks the work that we're planning and that we're hoping to do, and is really committed to institutional and cultural change here. And I think that's true of many of the people that are in leadership positions within our institution. As I mentioned, we have tremendously motivated contributors. We have people who, we do have people who are very much at the beginning of these conversations, and for whom, for example, the unrest, the social unrest around racial inequities and killing of Black people at the hands of law enforcement and what have you, have had really a visceral effect on these folks. But for many of them, they're very, very new to these conversations. And yet we have people at the other end of the spectrum that are very advanced in their thinking are very conversant in issues such as critical race theory that Andrea mentioned, that know and are working very, very hard at building a community of practice, say, for example, in our instruction and teaching portfolio that is focused on not only inclusive pedagogy, but also anti-racist pedagogy. So, you know, bringing all of that, that wide range of familiarity with these concepts and comfort levels in speaking about these issues is difficult, right? And it's not unlike any institution of higher ed, for certain. And with all of the built-in complexities of any large bureaucratic institution, I would imagine that even much smaller institutions have to deal with a fair amount of bureaucracy. So how do we effect change with this in the background? So with respect to the work that I've been doing, it has been very interesting, very hard. I'm working to build relationships largely through technological tools like Zoom and Teams and whatever other opportunities we have, having one-on-one conversations, and of course doing the work. As Annette mentioned, we appointed our inaugural Pulses Council on Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging. We approached that fairly deliberately in terms of representation within that group, that we wanted to ensure that even higher level, quote unquote, higher level administrators within the organization, within our organization are involved in this work and are committed to this work. We are committed to our own professional development as a leadership group within the Library and School of Information Studies. So we're looking consistently and planning, scheduling in opportunities to attend conferences, to take advantage of the many opportunities that we have on a campus level for professional development and for a growth across a variety of topics. For now, we're engaged in some short-term planning in terms of, well, where do we think the highest needs are with respect to our own unit? Where do we need to initiate conversations sooner rather than later about developing collaborations on a campus level? Because like I said, there is so much good work being done by so many different units on campus. And how do we make space for potential collaborations? But also understand that we functionally have, and in terms of our mission, have a unique place on campus. And so there are many things as we bring in conversations around equity in particular, where we have a unique sort of remit, if you will, in terms of how to deal with a lot of these issues. So we're involved with short-term planning for now. I'll explain why short-term in just a second. We are working on developing a common vocabulary, just as Andrea mentioned, right? And thinking, you know, I mean, very basic in terms of what is diversity, what is inclusion. When we come to much more, I think, advanced terms, in terms that can maybe for some communities be a bit provocative, but how can we frame conversations around definitions that are very, very tricky, such as the concept of whiteness, such as the concept of white supremacy culture and white supremacy, and how are those differentiated from culture, right? From majority culture and that sort of thing. And we're just committing to initiating the work. We some of the language that I probably say a little bit too often is that we're doing a bit of flying the plane while we build it. So as we develop these strategy, as we develop these priorities, and actually do some of the work, assess it, of course, iterate it as is needed. You know, what will this look like? So I mentioned that part of the more structured planning is going to be, it's kind of on hold a little bit until we as a unit are right now in the final processes of, we're finalizing our unit specific strategic plan, where diversity, equity, inclusion will be, they'll be fairly prominent. And so that will have many implications for the work of the council and for the work of the libraries and archives and related units at large. And again, trying to figure out a way to leverage campus efforts, a lots of terrific movement and scholarship and training that is happening at the campus level. Our LGBTQ Center has a great record of providing training, safe zone training. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that, as well as gender inclusion training that is highly regarded. Our Butler Center on campus for women in leadership presents, some outstanding programming. But also understanding and acknowledging that many units, many of our campus units are really focusing their attention on their particular stakeholder groups, on their constituencies, and that is completely understandable. So how do we make space for both those unique opportunities, those unique conversations across those units, and even within our unit, but also make room for collaboration. It makes it tricky when the work is as decentralized as it is. So what has been our approach so far? I've used this image also a little bit, maybe too much. It's been a lot about just throwing some wet spaghetti up against the wall or the refrigerator, right? So we're trying many different approaches. We're trying to see what resonates, what is going to invite people into a zone of discomfort where often the growth happens. I think the growth has to happen. And can rarely happen without discomfort. And so how do we create that sort of environment, that sort of culture, and also just establish norms for how we're going to do this work, how we're going to engage in conversation around this work, and most importantly, what are the expectations with respect to implementation of what's being used, right? Because we can go to all of the planning, all the webinars we want, all the training we want, but if it doesn't intrinsically change our views, our behavior, and begin to have an effect on organizational culture and on the way that we deal and accept and leverage difference, then it's really not having an impact. Our efforts are performative at best, right? We're approaching this work very deliberately with a commitment to developing everyone, all layers of the organization. So regardless of their classification status, right, whether they're faculty or staff, whoever they are, whatever their functional unit, whether they work in facilities, whether they're administrative in an administrative role, we're committing to development across all layers of the institution. We are working on building collaborations not only within the campus context, but also externally. I'll give you an example. I have been engaged for many years as a consumer of the training in a program out of Greensboro, North Carolina, called the Racial Equity Institute. And so what we're actually in the planning stages of doing, we're about there, is within the Big Ten Academic Alliance. What we're doing is we're bringing in the Racial Equity Institute and providing, with the intention of providing access to that content, to those developmental experiences, primarily to the deans, the directors, and maybe some associate directors, assistant directors, associate university libraries at our BTAA. It's important to think about facilitating this work both, at a grassroots level, sort of at the level of individual contributors within the organization. But if we don't have commitments from senior leadership, senior management, then these efforts will not have the impact that they need to have. The other tricky part, and again, conversations that we have, is that we need to provide support and growth for people, regardless of where they are in this journey. For those people for whom these conversations are very nascent, we need to provide those sorts of opportunities. And yet we need to provide the opportunities for people who are much more involved, much more engaged, have been conversant on these issues for a very long time. And for many people, really focusing on issues around racial equity. I think that, again, echoing what Andrea said, it's very difficult in terms of prioritization, because it's not that we don't care about LGBTQ populations, that we don't care about accessibility, that we don't care about representation of women in academia and that sort of thing. All of these are really, really critical issues, and we have to make space for them. I do think that the focus, the recent focus on racial equity is really opening a door. It is providing an access point for many of us to think about, the systemic, and also to be thinking about the degree to which the oppression of communities of color and the fraught history that we have all over the world, globally, not only in the United States, around enslavement and just around all of the policy issues in terms of citizenship and access in that way, that if we think about that historical trajectory, that racial oppression has really been the playbook for so many other types of oppression. So recognizing that, making space for that, and allowing that to be an access point for people, I think is very important. And then again, lastly, thinking about what it is across all of our functions, not only in terms of the work that we do in libraries, archives, OUR, all of these sort of unit adjacent, work adjacent sort of units, excuse me, but how does inequity show up in cataloging and in descriptive policies, right? It's not only about staffing, it's not only about recruitment, it's not only about retention, it's also assessing where power is within your organization, within your institution, and do those from historically marginalized, I use the term minoritized populations. Do people from minoritized populations carry any strength, any power? Do they control any resources, right, within the institution? And what is it that we need to do to fundamentally change that if the answer is no? And again, I think we're going back to a conversation about systems. So this is kind of where we are. I hope we left enough time for questions. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about the work and about maybe the drivers behind the work for me. There are lots of resources that are go-to resources, including the Racial Equity Institute that I referenced earlier. But I'm happy to stop and leave it open for questions and further comment. I will stop sharing now.
Thank you so much, both of you, for presenting this morning. I don't happen to see any questions in the chat as of yet, so if you do have any questions for our presenters, please feel free to plug them into the chat. We do also have Debbie asking if we can get a copy of the slides. I think Mark and Andrea, if you don't mind maybe emailing that to me, I can go ahead and have those shared on our SLA communications.
Not a problem.
Thank you.
I can do that.
Excellent, thanks. Any questions for our presenters?
While we wait for our questions, I do want to just comment on something that Mark stated that I did not address in my presentation, that I also think that's important. So thinking about this idea of community investment and making sure that everyone is seen as part of making our inclusion efforts very productive. We have to make sure that we also have support for those individuals that are not yet allies. What do we need to do to support those individuals, and how can we help give them the support and the training that they need so that they can too buy into our inclusion efforts as well?
Hello, my name's Ann Barker. Andrea, I think that this actually comes right from what you were just saying. I was curious earlier, you were talking about, I think you were saying something about disassociating diversity efforts from the grading for students so that they didn't feel that their grade was dependent upon saying the right thing. I'm wondering, similar to what you were just saying, and also on a corporate setting, at my company, we have a lot of we have a chief diversity officer now, which is a new position as of last year. There's a lot of programming a lot of people attend, but there's of course the sense of, you know, the people who are attending are the people who are already kind of buying in. And there isn't, it's hard to reach out to people who may not think that it's necessary. At the same time, I know that at other companies, they have linked it to their review goals. So they have goals for the year, and so there are diversity goals that are included. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that in terms of, yes, it's linked to your performance, that you have a diversity goal, and being able to draw in people who may not be allies, but yet it is something that's, because it's related to your grades or your pay, you may be attending not necessarily because you want to learn, but because you're feeling required to. And what your thoughts are on that in the way of drawing in more allies potentially.
Yeah, so I definitely think that when it comes to students, we have to make sure that we're creating a safe environment for students to grow. And I think that also needs to be applied to or extended to our faculty as well. But then again, and within the same vein, we have to make sure that there is a level of accountability. And what that looks like, that level of accountability is going to be different at every institution. If you do have a faculty member, if you do have someone on the staff that is just really um, anti-inclusive, right? Or if they're not on board with the mission or vision, how are we going to hold them accountable? Are we going to require that they participate in these types of conversations? Are we going to require that they try to implement inclusion within their respective syllabi? What are we going to do? There needs to be some type of accountability. I can't speak to what it will look like at certain institution, but I do think it's very important. I know that legally, universities and all types of institutions, they have to be very careful in terms of what could be a legal issue in terms of discrimination or reverse discrimination or those types of issues. But I do think those are something that they have to work in tandem. We have to have some type of accountability measure. Is it enough for us to have faculty members that's a part of an institution where we're saying that we are focused on diversity as a core value or as a strategic plan, but then we have members within our communities that they're not contributing to that in some type of way? And again, what that looked like, I think it looks different at every institution.
Great. Hi, everyone. I am Lee. I am the Professional Development Chair of LMD, and I'll be handling the questions that are in the chat today. We do have a question from Mimi. I like Andrea's comment about the use of term minority and the prerogatives associated with it. That makes sense, but what are the preferred terms? Even in this presentation, we've seen minority used.
Well, I think Mark used minoritized, and that has a different connotation than saying you are a minority, because connotatively, if the person that's saying minority, what are you saying connotatively? Minority, if we think about the connotation, it's offensive, right? And it's saying that a person is less than. But it is accurate to say that certain groups have been minoritized. We have been placed in this category where we have been seen as less than. And I think it's very important that, and that's one of the first things I said, that we have to, as institutions, you have to get together based on your values and talk about what is the agreed language, right? What is offensive? What is not offensive? What can we agree on that is not charged in any type of way or triggering to any type of group? What can we use, and how can we embed that language in everywhere? How can we all say the same thing?
Yeah, if I could just follow up, I think that it's a little bit, it's tricky because these things do change. The language does change. I mean, language has changed, and so we have to be sensitive to that. And I think that if we could build, there's a concept called cultural humility, which I actually prefer over the concept of cultural competency, where we just position ourselves to really be flexible and to be in learning mode. For example, right now, I mean, people very often talk about or refer to, larger minoritized population groups as Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And there's a particular reason, semantically, there's a particular reason, and that was because it's honoring in many ways the the unique experiences of enslavement and genocide that Black people, African Americans, enslaved Africans, and also even there's difference there, right? I mean, in terms of what that connotes, but just honoring those communities. But it doesn't mean that we're not also honoring the lived experiences of the marginalization and oppression of other communities of color. So it's just these things do change over time, yeah, we just need to be, I think, open to that and approach these conversations with a certain amount of humility.
Great, thank you, Mark and Andrea. Did anybody else have any other questions? Feel free to type in the chat or take yourself off mute.
And the racialequitytools.org, that's a really great glossary. Yeah, that's one of them that's pretty terrific. There's also one that I would recommend. There's an organization out of Washington, D.C. Called, I think it's called Pro Inspire. They, I can put the link in the chat. They created a document called, let me see if I get this right. Awake to Woke to Work, how to build a racial equity culture within an organization. And they have a really useful glossary as well that I would recommend.
Great, thank you. All right. Do I have one more question? Are these discussions ongoing, open to all the community, or more internal focused?
So I don't know if that question was for me or for Mark, if it was specific to Purdue. I know at ISU and also at Valparaiso, we've had a lot of these conversations about what's happening at our respective universities. And then also because I'm also a part of the American Library Association, a lot of these conversations are about what's happening within libraries and different types of library types, school libraries, public libraries, and academic libraries as well. So it's been both localized within the institution for me as well as broader within the library community.
Yeah, I would agree 100%. I think that, I mean, my previous employment was with the Association of Research Libraries, which is an institutional member organization of 125 of the largest research libraries in the United States and Canada. And yeah, these are happening both internally when we think about the implications of this work within our own community of practice, our communities of practice within our own institutions, within context of higher ed, but also it was the wet spaghetti, right? I mean, you pull on one string of spaghetti and you disrupt the whole plate. I mean, none of these systems operate in a vacuum or in a silo where there are always going to be implications beyond the institution. So yeah, I think if that's in fact answering that question. But I think they have to be both internal and external to the organization. We're not going to deal, when I talked about the collaboration we're building with the BTAA, I mean, these are just not issues that a library or an academic institution is going to make progress in alone. We can create our own strategies. We can be exemplars in many respects, but we're looking at working against very, very large and complex systems that are it's seemingly intractable. But if we don't try, I mean, I'm going to quote Ibram X. Kendi, we have to retain hope, right? We just have to retain hope, even in light of these problems that are seemingly intractable and unsolvable.
Great, thank you. And looks like we have one more question. This one is from Clara. How can these various associations and LIS collaborate together to do this work?
I think I think that collaboration can happen once there's more transparency. I talked a little bit about my research where I analyzed collection development policies with academic libraries. And sadly enough, I found that a lot of libraries were not willing to share their policies information. I had libraries tell me that, and I'm speaking specific to the field of LIS, but I've had libraries tell me, individuals from libraries say, well, we know we need more area help in this area, but they were not willing to be transparent about what was happening. And again, I think that in order for libraries and for any institutions to collaborate more, we have to be open to that interrogation. We have to be willing to show this is what we're doing, and be willing to allow that to be placed under scrutiny to determine whether or not it's effective or whether it's not effective. Because as an institution, if I'm able to look at another institution as a model because maybe they're doing something that is outstanding or stellar in terms of promoting diversity, I can model that within my own institution. And again, if an institution or library is willing to share their mistakes or mishaps, that can serve as a warning, or that can serve again as information for other institutions to use so that they can avoid going down that same path. If again, if something is happening at Purdue that we find out it's not working at Purdue, maybe that can be shared with the broader community so that we can learn, okay, maybe we need to avoid this. It did not work at Purdue. Maybe we need to look at it if we're thinking about implementing it and maybe changing it. Maybe having those conversations will help us be more collaborative.
Great, thank you. We do have one more question there from Catherine. Do you use any standard assumptions, agreements before engaging in discussions?
I'm not sure who that question is for, and I'm not sure I quite understand the question.
I answered it in a way, I mean, my interpretation of the question, but if that's where you were headed.
You answered it, Mark. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, terrific. There's a terrific. I mean, there are lots of different frameworks that you can tap into. There's one in particular that I reference all the time. I'll have to share this with you a little bit later. But there are a group of facilitators, trainers facilitators that work largely in the field of philanthropy. Jill Potapchuk and Jita, oh my gosh, the name's escaping me. They wrote a seminal, a very important piece called "Paying Attention to White Culture," I think is the name of the article. I can share the citation with you, but they suggest creating a container, a quote unquote container of cultural norms that are deliberately countercultural norms, but that would allow for optimal learning, optimal engagement, and will allow for difficult conversations to be had. So I'll share that with you all for Annette and the plan is to share with others. Yep.
That'd be really helpful. I've just found we've had training in our, law firm, company, whatever, and I find that without that container, there's a lot of harm that can be done. And I've gone through other trainings where that is such a central part of the beginning, before you start any conversations, and it's very, very, I think, essential. So thank you. I would love to know more.
Great, thank you. We are getting close to noon, so that's all the time we have for questions today. So I'm going to pass it over to Annette to close us out for today.
Excellent. So thank you again to Mark and Andrea for presenting and to Lee for helping moderate questions. As mentioned, I will wind up receiving these slides from our presenters and I will send them out and post them on our SLA Connect boards for LMD and the open forum. So you'll be able to review them from there. But thank you again, all of you, for attending, and a big thank you to all of our presenters for this morning. Have a good rest of your day. I'll be ending this meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark and
Take care,
Andrea.
everyone.